Our session now is towards an easier user journey, reducing service requests by Rakhi Banerjee and Karthik Gandham from Oracle Corporation, Hyderabad. So Karthik has worked on various products including ERP software, cloud-based integration platforms, mobile app development platforms, and Eclipse-based and cloud-based application development platforms. His areas of interest are best represented by the 4 Ps: physics, psychology, philosophy, and programming. Rakhi has more than 15 years of experience in the field of technical writing. She is currently working as a documentation manager in Oracle's Fusion Applications team. She has mentored and managed teams for about 5 years. She takes a keen interest in documentation design and architecture. She has done strategic management from Columbia Business School and has various certifications from Berkeley, MIT, and Yale University. In her free time, she learns Kathak. She has promised to save that performance for another day. Thanks to the pandemic, she can now dish out not only great documentation, but also some great cuisine from her kitchen. Over to you, Karthik and Rakhi.
Thank you so much, Prachi. That was a lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well in these times and taking good care of yourself and your families. So, welcome to our session towards an easier user journey by reducing service requests. This is the first time that Karthik and I are attending the STC presentation, STC conference, and I must say we are very thrilled about it. Thank you so much to the STC board for letting us present today. So let's get started. So what do you think this 40% could be? Amazon sale? Flipkart sale? Apple sale? Oh God, that would be a dream come true, right? 40% on Apple. But sorry to disappoint you, it's none of it. Would you believe me if I told you that by the end of this presentation, just by attending this presentation, you can reduce the service request in your organization by 40%. Unbelievable. If it was a live conference, perhaps I would have seen your faces and I would have known whether you're doubtful or you're believing me. Well, I brought Mr. Bean to add to my credibility. Not sure if he's doing a good job. Okay, guys, on an honest note, this stat is true. So in our session, we have step-by-step approach and some techniques that you can carry back to your workplace. And by doing that, it's 40% is definitely not unachievable, you know. Okay, and I was also throwing this number at you because it's Saturday afternoon post-lunch session, and I can totally understand how difficult it would be to stay awake. So hope this 40% kind of intrigues you. Okay, so we have some rules for this session. First, you can take a nap for 15 seconds, but just mind it, 15 seconds only once. And after that, join us back. Second, like Mr. Bean, okay, Mr. Bean happens to be my favorite, so sorry for overdoing it. So Mr. Bean is staring at his mobile, so can you. No Facebook, no Instagram, please. We want you to stay tuned. We have some very lovely stuff. Third, now this is a webinar, so our jokes will fall flat. So we request you to keep typing on the Q&A or the chat session, chat window, so that we know you are awake and listening to us yet. So let's get started. Now here is a very interesting quote that we found from Larry Ellison. And very interestingly, you see the word find errors in conventional wisdom. So what is this conventional wisdom? Now let's say we have a problem in hand and we devise a remarkable solution to tackle it. It works great and the users are very happy. Now the lessons and learning from this particular solution, creating the solution, becomes your conventional wisdom. Now understand that the users and their environments are changing very fast. So what works today will not work tomorrow. So what do? Now you tweak the solution that you created using the conventional wisdom to recreate something that is worthy of today's times. Okay, cool. And this applies to all areas of our workplace, including service requests. And we will see how. Okay, so in this pandemic, many of us were very dependent on online deliveries, right? So you must have ordered right from groceries to dresses to decor to something that will help you work from home. And many times you might also have raised service requests, right? Maybe you did not like the product. Maybe there was a delay in the delivery, and for various reasons. So similarly, our users also raise service requests for various reasons. It could be bad documentation, bad user interface, bad design, or maybe they're just stuck and they don't know how to proceed, right? Okay, now let's talk about our favorite Swiggy. Now let's say I ordered my favorite dish on Swiggy and it's delayed. What do? I first try to track it on the application. I'm not able to find any answers. It still shows that my delivery boy is there, but he hasn't reached. So I try to call him up. He doesn't take the call. So I call up the customer representative and I ask, where is my dish? He says, ma'am, we really regret this inconvenience and your order is there in 20 minutes. Now think about it. Does it really make you happy? It doesn't, because I'm hungry, I'm angry, I'm frustrated. I want my food right now. And that is what happens in real circumstance also, right? Your customers need the answers right away. Now, what could Swiggy do? Swiggy could go back to the restaurant and make sure that this doesn't happen again. And maybe, it can also go to 10 other restaurants and make sure that it never happens again. Okay. So now this is the difference between reactive and proactive approach towards service request management. Okay. So in our session, throughout the session, you will keep hearing about proactive approach. And a disclaimer here. So this session is based on a true story, and any resemblance that you find in this story is purely intentional. So let's get going. Now here is a typical user journey. You creating a service request is very time taking because they don't get answers immediately. So support works on it and then they get the answers. So there are various sources of help that the user tries to go through. So first, as a user, now get into the shoes of the user. First, I try to figure out on my own. I don't find the answers. I look at some labels or contextual help, or maybe they are walkthroughs, and I still don't get the answers. What is your next step as a user? What do? You ask your colleague, you ask Google Devta, nothing comes to your rescue. And finally, hopefully, the users reach our help guides. And when that also fails, users raise a service request. There is a possibility that they raise it as soon as they don't find answers from the UI, but mostly they try to do some kind of research before they raise a service request. So this is the typical user scenario. Now let's say user has raised a service request and it reaches the organization. Now what happens in the organization? Support receives, excuse me, support receives the service request, and to the best of their ability, they try to resolve the service request. Now, here also we need to take a step back. Maybe the support has resolved, but we need to take a step back and think, why was it that the user did not find information, right? And you will see such cases in the presentation later. So now support logs the bugs, and for documentation or development or the product management team, depending upon what the issue is. And then everybody tries to work to the best of their ability and resolve the service request. Okay, this is all great. The service request is resolved. Now, if you notice here, the whole process is centered around support team. It becomes my problem as a writer or as a dev team only when the service request comes to me. So what is it that we changed in Oracle? So in Oracle, we changed this mindset. So we made it everybody's problem. So we brought everybody together under the same roof, the development team, the technical writers, the product management team, and of course the support team. And we made everybody look at the service request together. So, excuse me, sorry. Okay, so everybody started looking at it together. Now there's total chaos, right? Because everybody is together in one roof, under one roof, and the room is bubbling with fresh ideas, fresh opinions, feedback, but you don't know where to go, where to start. And therefore, you need a data-driven approach to service request. So I was reading this book, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, and it says start wherever you are. And that is exactly what we believed in Oracle. So what we did, we brought everybody together and we created categories in which we wanted to capture data. Now we all have lots of data around, right? All that you need to do is that you collate and capture that data in a way from which you can derive some meaning out of it. Now there were various sources from which we could derive the data. So from users, when the users raise service requests, they give you a lot of information. They give you process, they give you the product, and they also give you the flow where they are stuck. So that is one data point that you could capture. The next is from support team when they actually fix the service request, irrespective of whether they logged a bug or they didn't log a bug. Now you could actually take this. Now the support could give you various information such as, was it related to one customer or was it related to all customers? And what was the actual bug? Was it infrastructure related, or maybe there's some enhancement requests and things like that. Now from analytics also, you could, sorry, this video is distracting. Okay. So from analytics, you could have lots of data. For example, number of page views. Now, number of page hits is a very good insight into what topics are being used, right? So you could look at those, and audience reports gives you insights into what are the unique profile of visitors that are looking at your websites, documentation websites. Now, flow report is a very is a graphical representation of how the users have traveled in your website. So what is the entry point? Let's say they came from Google or the application, and what was the path that they took? For example, I'll give you a very, very simple example here. Let's say your flow is creating calendar, updating calendar, and deleting calendar. Now, in your user circumstance or in user scenario, they never use updating. They are not allowed to update the calendars. So obviously they are looking at only creating and deleting, right? So that kind of insights you can get from this flow reports. Now, duration is again a very, very important thing. See, it's not always a happy news if the user is spending a lot of time on a particular topic. It could also mean that the topic is so complex that the user is not able to look at it, right? Okay. Now we have captured data in various categories, in various buckets, and slowly what happens is over a period of time, the patterns start emerging from it. So in our case, there were different buckets that we created, and trust me, you can create as many buckets as you want, as much categories as you want. In our case, we kind of created in support specific, product specific, document specific. So 41% of the service requests we found was because of user assistance, out of which 30% of the service requests could be avoided with better user assistance. 11% of the service requests could be avoided with better search capabilities. So this was a very good insight because you now know where you need to spend your energy or investment on, right? Okay. Now, as I mentioned, there are various ways you can collect this data, and various categories, various patterns emerge out of it. So another way that we collected this data was on the product areas. So if you see, setup had 25% of documentation service requests, which means definitely that is the focus area that you would ideally want to depend on, right? But what happens is that you can also create relations as in the previous slide. For example, I showed you that here we created it as per user assistance or support specific issues or customization issues. So you can also create relationships between these patterns. Now, if I see 25% of documentation SRs are for setup, now I could further create a relationship and I can say, okay, 13% of this 25% is actually because the user could not reach the documentation. So definitely I need to do something about my search capability, right? Okay. Now you have, let's say you have come up with 5 focus areas. It could be error messages, it could be search capabilities, it could be some simplifying some topics, or some topics you want to restructure. Now, it's not possible in a real life scenario that you work on all the possible focus areas that you have found, or all the categories, or all the patterns that you have found. So you will have to make very informed investment decisions. And how do you do that? Let's see. So maybe I'll just wrap up till here. So what we did was we brought everybody together. We looked at the data. We created categories for that data in which we wanted to capture data. We captured data. We created patterns which gave us the focus areas. And now the question is, which focus areas should I work on? Okay. So any focus area that you work on will have business benefits. So the very ideal situation is that wherever the business benefit is the most, I would go ahead and work on it, right? So the answer is return on investment. So how do we calculate it? You need your financial value and your project cost. Here is the formula. So in our case, what we realized was that financial value was very tricky, especially for user assistance pieces. So what we did was we created this financial value for one area, which was the setup that I showed you in the previous slide. And accordingly, we created an estimate of the ROI for each area that we wanted to work on, each focus area or each categories, so to say. Okay, now this is very, very ideal, right? That you have your return of investment, and then accordingly you will create, you will choose your focus areas. You will determine which focus areas you want to work on. But in real life, what happens is you have lots of constraints, right? So what you do is you calculate your ROI, and then you apply constraints on it. And how do you do that? You prioritize. So there are a lot of prioritization tools in the available. We used RISE, which means reach, impact, confidence, effort. So what does reach mean? So reach is basically the number of customers that you think you will reach because of this change. So let's say it's a big feature or it's a big change, and you will reach 2,000 customers. So that's your reach. Now, what is an impact? Impact is what kind of impact the change will have. It could be high, medium, or low, and you could rate it anywhere out of 10. So I could say that this particular change has an impact of 7. Now, let's say, okay, first let's look at effort before we look at confidence. So effort is man per month. So how many months will one person require to make this change is the effort. Confidence is the level of confidence you have on all of these 3 other parameters. Now, let's say I'm very confident about the reach and effort, but I'm not too sure about the impact because I don't know how many customers kind of use it and what ways they use this particular product which is going to change. So in that case, you can level the confidence also. I can say that it's only 70% because I'm not too sure about the impact. And this formula gives you the RISE score. And then based on the RISE score, you can decide on the focus area or the category or the pattern that you want to work on. So we calculate the ROI. We also calculate the RISE score. And depending on these two, we kind of give the final, we decide the final areas that we want to work on. And see, this prioritization tool makes it very easy for hard to compare ideas. Now it was, let's say all the 5 made sense, but I can't possibly work on 5. So I'm because of this prioritization tool, now I can go and choose only 3 focus areas which I am going to work on. Now let's say I have decided on working on 2 focus areas or 2 categories. One could be error messages, and the other could be some topics only in the implementation guide for the setup product. Okay. The first thing that you should now do is you have to know where you want to reach, where you want to go, what is it that you want to achieve. So for every focus area, You should have your objective or key results, better known in the industry as OKRs. You should have these OKRs ready. Now, what could be the objective? For example, in our case, we said reduce documentation related service requests from 30 to 20% within 4 quarters. And now, see, in 4 quarters, if using this whole flow, we're able to reduce by 30%. I'm sure the 40% number that I gave you is quite doable, right? Okay, it's all about doing the right thing at the right time. So key results. So one of our key results is create user assistance videos for topics that resulted in 5 or more service requests. So we have created focus, we have decided on which focus areas to work on. And then we decide for each focus area, we have one OKR so that we know it not only helps you evaluate the health of this SR reduction project, but it also gives you a direction as to what you want to achieve and where you want to go. With this, I hand over to Karthik. I hope he's not sleeping. Karthik, post-lunch session. Karthik, you're there?
Yes, thank you, Rakhi. Hey, hello everyone. Let me quickly share my screen.
Stop share, yes.
Sure. So far we've seen the user journey, and we've also seen how to capture data and get insights to come up with action items and prioritize them. Next, we will look at specific SR reduction techniques that we found very helpful. I hope some of these are applicable to you as well. So the first thing that we always kept in mind when we were looking at SRs was to keep the user journey in mind. So the goal was to shift left and try and provide help earlier in the user journey. And how do we do that? Add something early on which could eliminate the need for a next step, or we could simplify the content, or we could maintain and automate when simplification or elimination aren't possible so that we have accurate information. And when we look at the user journey, service request is one of the most painful and time-consuming aspect from a user point of view because of SLAs and the kind of time it takes for them to get a proper response and actually get a solution. And it's also a quite expensive affair, even from an organization standpoint. So here are some product improvements which we looked at. So if you see, setup was one of the area with high number of SRs. So the first thing that we tried to do was simplify processes and wizards. So when we, let's say, have setup which spans across pages, we could have a consolidated wizard instead of actually users having to go to the documentation and look at the step-by-step process. And then we tried to provide buttons or links within error messages. So for example, let's say we are trying to make a payment using a mobile wallet, and then the error message could just say that you couldn't, or the transaction couldn't go through because of insufficient balance. But then the message could also provide a link or a button or options so that we can actually add money to the wallet before proceeding with the transaction. Right? The other one is tagging UI and documentation of features that would be deprecated. So with high-paced environment, we're always focused on the new features that would be coming up, but sometimes we tend to lose focus of what would be deprecated and what about the users who are already using that and what kind of impact that would have. So whenever we plan to deprecate a feature, a couple of releases earlier as well, we can start tagging the UI and documentation so that new users who are probably considering implementing a solution or using a certain feature could look at new alternatives, and people who are already using it would be aware of the deprecation for sure. And the last one was to add links to prerequisite pages. So this might always not be possible, but this approach typically works with implementation setups. So let's say a user has to create roles, but before that, user has to when let's say an administrator is trying to create users, but let's say a prerequisite is to set up the roles required. So in such cases, maybe the user's page could have a link at the top to make sure that you've already implemented or created the roles that you want. Of course, there are all newer ways of doing that. Maybe within the process as well, you could allow users to add roles on the fly as well, but it would again depend on this design and how you think users would use your application. So documentation enhancement techniques. So the first one would be to create topics with roles in mind. Again, though a lot of things that we're going to talk on these slides would sound obvious, but these are very crucial, especially because we're looking at reusability and creating generic content. And these might not always apply to all users. So I, as an administrator, I might be interested in a certain aspect of an application, but as a developer or an end user, I might be looking at something else. So whenever we're creating common content or overviews, I think this is one critical aspect where we are looking at reusability. The second one was to add topics that help make decisions. So again, with setups and a few other aspects, there could be multiple ways of achieving something. And the moment users see 10 ways of doing something, I mean, how do I know which one to pick? So that is the first thing that comes to our mind, right? So whenever there are multiple ways of doing something, we try and add topics which help make those decisions. The last one is using tables, flowcharts, and graphics. So the reason a lot of us as writers probably avoid creating these is because they're very time consuming. But on the other hand, they make topics feel lighter and reduce the cognitive load. So whenever we're creating these tables, graphics, and flowcharts, we can also improve our frameworks and tools so that these processes are easier and more of us do these things. So here's a quick case study where we had quite a few service requests. So the first thing that we looked at was all the available sources of information, and the existing information was scattered across multiple topics or guides. And then we found that the content was too lengthy, and in some cases the user roles weren't clear and the flow wasn't clearly visible, and they would lose the tide. So the first thing we did was we reached out to product management and architecture teams to identify the gaps and then consolidated the content. And then we created a high-level snapshot with clear roles and actions defined. So just by looking at this one simple flowchart, I know that which users are involved, I know which products are involved, and what is the sequence in which these steps must be performed. And there's also a small overview or summary of what is happening at each step and what the user is supposed to do at that step. Next, messages in UI text. This is one area where there's a lot of ROI because maybe end of the day, it's just about writing a couple of lines. But then, what are the aspects within messages that cause service requests? So one of the first things was to actually go back to the previous journey and see if we could even avoid messages with design. So especially when we are working with applications which probably have been created 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So maybe the framework at back then wouldn't have allowed something, or maybe it would have been a design decision because there was a lot of processing overhead. So to avoid those things, a certain decision might have been made in the past. However, with new frameworks, we can start performing more checks within the UI and avoid error messages. The next one is to provide cause and solution. This is again one of those cases where we're generally focused on reusability and might not provide a solution, or we might want to come up with a bit more generic messages. So this is again a point where we would have to make sure or understand the trade-off. And if we think it might be confusing, then we should try and be a bit more specific. And the final one about messages is displaying the list of accepted values. So imagine we are trying to upload an image or a video, and then we get an error saying that it's not a supported format, right? So is there a way on the UI where we can actually first convey that what are the supported formats and the supported file sizes? So that would make it way easier. And then the other one we wanted to talk about, which probably is a more realistic scenario, happens with API documentation. So with UI, we have control over certain values that a user can enter. So let's say we can have drop downs, radio buttons, etc. When you're working with APIs, users might always not know what certain potential value or a possible value there is. So in such cases, the messages can provide supported data formats and the list of possible values. And there were also some SRs around complex business flows. And this is one of those areas where the ROI is less. So probably we could create user assistance videos or work with product management to simplify business flows or use walkthroughs. But then since these have very less ROI, we usually set a higher number of bar where before we start addressing these. Improving findability. So these are certain things which our engineering teams are constantly working on, and we found some of them really interesting and wanted to share quick highlights. So the first one is to optimize for search engines. A lot of search for documentation still happens on search engines. So, and also one more challenge of search engines is typically they might look at pages which have been used the most, and the odds are that again becomes a feedback loop where the same older versions of the documentation are being used again and again. So can we optimize for search engines so that our latest guides or content is displayed? The second one is to help to improve search experience on our help center. We'll also take a quick look in a moment of the kind of changes that we had made. The third one is to display relevant documentation prominently. So let's say there's a lot of views to a particular documentation article. So can we display it more prominently? Can we move it within the application in a user assistance pop-up so that user can directly reach that link? The last one is to extend documentation reach, where we try and share doc links whenever possible, especially when support or when we are providing answers over forums, so that users might start looking at documentation and explore other aspects as well. So here are some of the changes that were made in the recent past. So before I entered the keywords, I was on the cloud applications page. So when I'm entering a search query, the odds are I'm looking for some content within cloud applications. So this filter was added by default and helps narrow search results. And then we also have some filter parameters, which most users generally tend to use. And then it was also very interesting how the results were displayed. So when a search query could belong to any of the products, all the product names are displayed. And instead of displaying a bunch of links, because generally whenever we see 10 search results, we would probably look at the top 3 or 5 and then before changing our search query. But here, the way the results are organized, we know which guide we are looking at, which product we are looking at, and the odds of reaching the right link faster are higher. So far we've been looking at the reactive approach per se, where we know what type of SRs came in and how we could break them down. But there are also certain long-term strategy changes that we can make to fix these beforehand. So let's look at those. So the first one would be to monitor various touch points. So we could look at forums and communities where we could get a sense of the kind of tasks that users are trying to perform and what they're trying to achieve and where they're running into problems. And one amazing thing about forums is you have a lot of experts there who would be providing inputs, which also acts as a great source of inputs for our own documentation. The second one is to update legacy documents. So often, when there are minor product changes over a period of time, uh, a documentation might become obsolete or inaccurate at some level. So we can monitor documents which have high number of views and then uh, make sure they're technically accurate and easily usable. The third one would be to track support articles. So the same way we look at statistics around documentation, we could also do that with support articles. So let's say a support article has high number of views or a high amount of usage. In such cases, we can actually consider moving that into documentation or probably if there are certain articles which have high this thing, then maybe we could go about product changes as well. The last one, again, I think these have also been covered, would be to monitor feedback mechanisms and survey results on a regular basis. And so far, we've seen what was being done and what is being done. But going forward, how do we think things could change in the near future? So whenever we're looking beyond, we think we could use data classification tools and forecasting models, which could tell us which areas could have higher number of SRs. So let's say in a quarter, the usage of a certain product goes up. So the odds of SRs in that area could increase. So probably we would want to shift our focus, even keeping the future in mind. And then we have chatbots within some of our applications, which help users perform their tasks. So can we actually use these chatbots to answer user queries in the context? And how can we use the metadata or the context of the user to provide better search experience and better documentation experience? And how we could take this integrations and this insights further into other modes of delivery, such as voice assistants. So that's all I had. Thank you so much. Is there anything else we wanted to add, Rakhi?
Thank you. Pretty much covered all, and we can open up for questions. So Prachi, I see that there are already 3 questions.
3 questions.
So, so maybe we can start with answering those. Yep. So Tanushri has asked us, this question might make me sound okay, but how did you collect the data to identify the pattern? Okay, so Tanushri, what we did was we together started looking at the data that was already there, which was very simple, For example, you can see product wise, and then you slowly keep adding categories. So let's say setup is the product that I'm looking at, and I know for sure that I have the highest number of documentation service requests in those. So in that case, I will add some categories, they could be, so let's say there is a user flow. So maybe you could use that flow as possibly every that could be one data point that you could consider. And then slowly you keep adding to it. It's not like a one-time activity that, you capture data or you create categories in which you want to capture data. Slowly you have to keep improvising on this flow that you're capturing data for. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, Karthik, please.
Just wanted to add a little bit there. So other things which we could do is look at similar products and maybe have one focus area and then try and extrapolate that data. So there are also other mechanisms like that where you can look at smaller amount of SRs and then make sure that it also fits the overall pattern.
Thanks, Karthik. Manak has asked us, how do you effectively measure confidence in rice score formula? Okay, So there's no short way of doing it. You can, depends on how you want to do it. But then ideally it would be better if you can create a baseline with one. Let's say you are comparing 5 ideas, right? So one of it you create a baseline, and using that baseline you can score all. So at least you will be very, very sure that all the scores are very consistent in your approach. See, other 3 factors are quite quantitative, but then confidence is a lot about gut and what you feel about your scores. So perhaps creating a baseline would be a great idea. Yeah. Okay. So another question, is there any possibility to identify the gaps if a doc is not updated, but a feature in the UI is updated? So perhaps, in case of Agile, it kind of solves it a little because, everybody is going hand in hand. So it's easier to identify there. But then, service request kind of tells you that, this is some feature where you don't have documentation. But then I would really suggest that you work very closely with your dev team and your product management team to keep it updated. Anything that you want to add, Karthik, here in any of these questions?
No.
Okay,
So,
I think you have one more. Yeah. So with new features to be documented for each release, how will you prioritize working on the SR bucket?
okay. So see, this any initiative that you work on, you have to give bandwidth to your resources, to your people, right? So what we did was we kind of created some 20% versus 80%. So 80% was for feature documentation and 20% is for working on this SRs. And that's why I clearly mentioned that you have to take your management's buy-in, you have to discuss the focus areas, and you have to prioritize which areas you will work on. So that's very important, so that none of the areas suffer.
Okay, we have a question in the chat window from Sadhna. What mechanism or tool was used to filter percentage of the doc service requests, and what was the time estimation to arrive at this pie chart analysis?
So I'll break it into 2 pieces. What mechanism or tool was, so we were using one internal tool by Oracle to kind of collate all this information, the patterns and the data. So we used an internal Oracle tool to do that. And time estimation to arrive at this pie chart was approximately 5 to 6 months.
Okay. The next one from the chat window again. What are some of the areas of automation in technical documentation that you would recommend?
So there are a lot of forecasting models available. I can't possibly remember a name here, but then forecasting models are very good because you would exactly know what users are looking for. So those models you could possibly work on. Karthik, do you remember the name? Maybe we could give the name here. I can't recall it at this point.
No, I don't remember the names. But then usually we would have certain areas in which we could apply these would be API documentation or areas where the code could give you inputs or code could generate some parts of the documentation. Other areas where automation is possible is where, let's say, we are talking about user roles and the kind of privileges or access they would have. So some of the areas, I mean, maybe I just went off on a tangent, but generally these are some of the areas where automation is used a little more than other areas.
So a question on the similar lines, is there any way to automate the dog gap and UI feature gap process?
Can you just repeat that question?
Yeah. So the person wants to know if there is any way to automate the, I think, the dog gap and the UI feature gap process.
Automation is, see, in Agile world, again, sorry, I keep going back to Agile because I really like that process. But in Agile world, it's very easy. You create your backlogs for everybody, right? So when you create your backlogs for the product teams, you also create backlogs for the documentation teams. And therefore, it's very difficult to miss anything there.
Correct.
But in case you don't have, then perhaps the only way out is that you keep a very close look on what features teams are releasing, because everybody would have a what's new, right? So keep a close look on the what's new feature, what's new document, and then make sure that everything is documented accordingly.
So Tony Xavier really likes the search enhancements that you spoke about. And did you require backend coding to enhance the search page layout? And if so, could you elaborate on that?
Okay, so yes, there was a lot of engineering done for that to enhance that. But then there's another team which does that. So perhaps Karthik and I can't take this question.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions in the chat. Okay, just a quick time check. Rajiv, how are we doing on the time? Are we?
Yeah, I guess we can go on. Maybe you can take because it is a continuous session on the same link. We can go on till 4
we can. Okay.
3:59. You have to stop just to give one minute to Sangeeta to settle in.
Okay. Okay. So this is a question from Sangeeta. Who works on the ROI and RIC formulas, and how do you get the reach number?
Okay, so for this, you will have to include the quality leaders. The tech writing team or the development team or the support team alone can't do it. So you have to involve the quality leaders for this. So what you do is you have to see, management is one thing where you are presenting the focus areas. So you have come up with the focus areas, involve your quality leaders to come up with the ROI and RICE formula, and then go to your management with all these numbers.
Okay. The next one is again from an anonymous attendee. If a product does not have analytics to capture data as part of the data capturing process, what are some of the other ways to capture it then?
So integrating with Google Analytics is one of the easiest ways. So it's probably a little or maybe even non-intrusive. So though it's used typically for generic websites, probably sales or some other flows. So even when we're looking about the flow charts and flow reports, so it would also give those. But how we would go about interpreting these reports could change. I mean, for example, let's say the amount of duration Google Analytics will give us. So yeah, I think the easiest way of going about it would be to integrate it with other tools which can capture analytics.
Okay, because since in this conference there has been a lot of talk about Google Analytics, we have a question from Ayan, who again asks us, is there a tool other than Google Analytics that is good enough?
I mean, there are in-house tools, but yeah, I mean, from outside, at least that's one popular tool.
And somebody wants to know, with new features to be documented for each release, how will you prioritize working on the SR bucket?
So like I mentioned, you have to take your management buy-in, because they are the guys who will give you time to work on these initiatives. So you have to, for example, in our case, we had like 80% and 20% of a resources time. So accordingly, you have to talk to your management and get a buy-in to work on such stuff.
Okay. D. Datta wants to know, is there any possibility to identify the gaps if a doc is not updated, but a feature in the UI is updated?
I think we already took this question, right?
We took it, right?
Yeah. So in an agile world, like I mentioned, it's quite easy. But if you're not working on agile, keep a close look on the what's new features.
Okay. So I think, okay. Is GA an open source tool? Okay. Would you like to answer that one? Is Google Analytics an open source tool?
I think so. I'm not too sure.
So I think I can answer that. Google Analytics is not an open source tool, but it's free to use. And there's a difference in the two approaches. In that, you cannot modify the original code and figure out how Google Analytics actually functions. But to use Google Analytics within your environment, that is easily doable and there's no cost to that. So it's not open source, but it's free to use.
Thank you.
Thanks, Partha. Okay, I think we've covered all the questions now. So thank you, Rakhi and Karthik. It's been a wonderful session. Thanks for making it very interesting and making sure everybody was awake and engaged. So thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
very,
We love
very,
doing
very,
it.
very engaging session, Rakhi and Karthik. And welcome to STC India Annual Conference. We look forward to having your participation in each, later conferences now on. So this
Thank
was
you,
definitely
Rajiv.
very good session, and everyone was really wide awake. So
I
thank you
must
so
Thank you
much.
so much, guys.
I must also say, Rajiv, that the session that they've conducted was perfect for the post-lunch session, and
Absolutely.
despite being post-lunch, we still crossed 150 at one point.
Yeah, super.
Which
Yes,
is something
yes.
really worth
So the gamble I played kind of paid off.
Paid off.
Awesome. You rescued me, Rakhi, Karthik. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you put us on the spot.
Yes, first time speakers are always put on spot, right? So you have passed the fire test actually.
Probably
Thank you so
everyone
much.
slept.
Absolutely nice session. Thank you so much.
No,
Thank
you
you
see,
so
we get
much.
notifications as to who's not paying attention, Karthik. Roll out. We have in-house analytics. Google Analytics there.
Thank you so much, guys. It was an
Thank you.
absolute pleasure being here, and I'm sure Karthik will agree.
Yeah.
Please
that was
enter the
wonderful.
feedback. The link is posted in the chat.